I want to take a sort of a bird's eye view. I want to talk about some of the things that are happening on the ground, but I want them to be inspired or understood, viewed through a broader perspective that has to do with ideology. I listened to all the articulate, elaborate presentations that preceded mine. I learned a lot. I want to, with the kind permission of the speakers that they'll have to give me because I'm just going to do it, I want to nab some points that they mentioned because they fit my general purpose very well. And I'd like to start with Michel's presentation, which I found very illuminating. He talked about how, the transition that we are seeing from zealotry to realpolitik. And I guess the first point I want to make is that in many ways, if you exempt a few initial years of intoxication and all-out war at the very beginning of the establishment of the Islamic Republic, it's always been about realpolitik. And it's always been about realpolitik not because Iran is liberal or moderate necessarily, but because the translation of Iranian Shia thought into a revolutionary message is, I want to say, first and foremost, pragmatic and realistic. That comes with being Shia. All Messianists know, well, most do, that the coming of the Messiah is going to take the world by storm. That it's going to cause radical upheaval. That it's going to change everything. We believe in the coming of the Messiah, say observant Jews, every day, and we will wait faithfully until he comes. Our job is to wait, not to hasten his coming. And in many ways, or not in many ways, that's a studious disclaimer. That position, we're waiting for the Messiah, we're not doing anything active to make him come quicker. That is also the traditional Shia position, and it is a position that was translated into a political ideology by the thinkers who preceded the actual events of 1979. The Islamic Republic of Iran is, at heart, Messianist, and it sees itself almost by default as pragmatic and realistic, deriving directly from this Messianism. Messianism is not fundamentalism. Messianism is not an understanding of the Word of God in a literal way that allows one to implement it directly. Messianism implies a clear separation between what happens on earth in the human realm and what happens in heaven, dependent on God's will and logic. Human logic isn't divine logic. It's the responsibility of faithful human beings who know their job to lead their lives on earth in a pragmatic way, to understand reality as an emerging phenomenon, as a vibrant energy, as something that changes, to be charged by faith with constantly evaluating and calibrating one's understanding of reality, and to do so in a way that allows for potential gains to be as broad as possible while taking into account the prices that need to be paid. Why am I starting out with this this rhetoric? Why am I quoting potentially Iranian speakers? Because I think a lot of them would say this. Because if you take all of the information that was presented to us today, and for a second I'm talking about Emmanuel and Yaniv's presentations, which definitely cover tremendous networks that are in place, real practices, a whole clandestine universe of Iranian activity. You can see it as, just as Yaniv said, in a very forthright way, and I applaud him for it, as something that could potentially lead to terrorism. You could see it as blatant terrorism, but you could also see it as the way in which a society, a country, a nation, a network, whatever you want to call it, functions in a very limited environment, limited by sanctions imposed on it by people who wish it harm. I'm not saying that the conflict between Iran and the West is not a justified one. I am, however, saying that you can look at all the information we just saw as a pretty impressive display of efficiency in the face of great adversity if you were Iranian. The notion that the initial Iranian premise, that the initial premise of Hezbollah is terrorism just because they are Iran and Hezbollah, is, to my mind, well, I'll use a very scientific term, wrong. Right? And not because Iran and Hezbollah are great lovers of peace, but because Iran and Hezbollah are first and foremost pragmatists. They are practitioners. They are survivors. Survival comes with the Shia ethic. That is what persecuted minorities do. They are resilient. They survive. They evaluate reality on an ongoing basis. They figure out their place in that political reality, and they situate themselves in the most efficient way. These criminal organizations in Latin America, in Europe, they are ways for raising money in an environment that does not allow Iran or Hezbollah access to the financial resources they need. The real question is, what do they ultimately want? Do they want to export the revolution and create a world or a Middle East or a Latin America that will look like Iran under the doctrine of velayat-e faqih, the rulership of the all-knowing, omnipotent jurisconsult? I put it to you that that is not the case. It is not consistent with Iranian behavior. And once again, Iran is not a peace-loving nation. It's a dark dictatorship. The Islamic regime is an authoritarian regime. It does not wish its enemies well, and it resorts to not just clandestine, but also criminal and potentially fatal policies in order to execute those wishes. That doesn't mean that the Islamic Republic is not pragmatic. That doesn't mean that it doesn't weigh cost and benefits very, very seriously. And it doesn't mean more than anything that its foremost wish is to survive. If all of these plans, all of these desires to take over the Middle East were what motivates Iran, Iran could have committed itself to making a serious move for political control of, say, Lebanon or Bahrain a long time ago. The Iranian means for surviving is the exercise of influence. How do you gain influence? You gain influence by presence. Presence is not decision. Presence is not a zero-sum game. Presence is ongoing, continuous, and it strives to remain so. In order to do that, Iranians need means and resources, but they also need goodwill. They also need trust. These communal organizations, like the ones we saw in Latin America, are not just means for raising cadres of potential terrorists. They're means for creating a long-term relationship with these people. What this long-term relationship will enable Iran to do? All sorts of things, including terrorism. But this is not a setup that is exclusively geared towards generating and sustaining terrorist networks. And I'll do you one better. Not only is Iran realistic and pragmatic, I want to suggest to you, Iran is also at heart defensive. Iranians, like Israelis, and that's a comparison that I like making, so I'll most likely make it a few more times during the time I have. Iranians, like Israelis, understand themselves to be alone adrift in a sea of hostility. They feel like not only the Sunni Arabs are out to get them, but the entire world doesn't like them much, certainly under the Islamic regime. They're not wrong. Their understanding of how to survive in the face of such adversity is to maintain constant, continuous presence and friction with the entire world. That stands in stark contrast to the way Israel does business. Former Prime Minister Ehud Barak famously coined the phrase, Israel's a villa in the jungle. That means we live in a hostile environment. We don't want to be a part of that environment. If that environment threatens us, we make our walls as high as we can. If somebody threatens to breach those walls, we act surgically. We bomb them and we go back to base. The Iranian position is the complete opposite. Iranians think of themselves as, again, just like Israel, adrift alone in a hostile ocean. But they think that if they isolate themselves willingly, that will give all their enemies an opportunity to band together and get them at the first chance they get. So the Iranians sustain a constant presence in their enemy's face. They are a thorn in their enemy's side. They don't pretend that they are capable of winning the battle. What they want is to survive long enough to influence the potential outcome of the dance. How do they do that? By being present everywhere they can be present. Will they resort to terrorism if pushed? Yes. They're not polite. Will they resort to terrorism because their master plan is to kill as many of their enemies as possible and install fuqaha, religious jurisconsults, wherever they can? No, at least not to my understanding. So the title of this panel, Iran's Global Reach, Terrorism is a Means of Exporting the Revolution. I humbly, object. I don't think Iran is engaged in exporting its revolution. I think the stage where Iran sustained the notion that it could export its revolution expired at the very most 5 years after the Islamic Republic came into being. And I mention this date because it's important to me for understanding perhaps the main element we discussed today, and that is the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, and particularly its Quds Force. I want to suggest that the Revolutionary Guards are not a zealous organization. They were established in a very practical way in order to protect the achievements of the revolutionary regime, to defend the Islamic Republic, and they were forged in the crucible of the Iran-Iraq War. They're not a secret commando that was hatched in order to carry out massive terrorist plots. They're soldiers. They're soldiers who go to the worst who suffer the brunt of the action at the worst of the front lines. That is how they understand themselves. And they expand wherever they can. They're soldiers. They hold on powerfully. That's what they do. They've got their commissars and they've got their ideology, and wherever they go, the ideology goes with them. But they're not great thinkers or strategists. And Qasem Soleimani, to the best of my understanding, is a very, very, very capable field operator, but not much more than that. I don't think he wants to be much more than that. I think he understands his mission as defending the Islamic Republic. And I'm going back to that word, defending. This is a defensive posture. It's very proactive. But at heart, it's an attempt to survive, not necessarily an attempt to expand. And the Revolutionary Guard that was forged in the crucible of the Iran-Iraq War maintained its attitude after that war ended. The Islamic Republic grew. It grew stronger. It grew more stable. It managed to shape its strategic environment. The Revolutionary Guard played an important part in those moves, not so much through the spread of ideology. That is not what strengthened the Islamic Republic. The Islamic Republic invested a great deal of effort and money and time in stabilizing Iran internally. It created a very efficient mechanism, albeit one that looks weird to Western eyes, but it works. It doesn't work because the Iranian people is in love with the Islamic Republic. It works because it works. And even the Iranians who don't like the Islamic Republic, and there are a great many of them, are willing to admit that this is, as Shakespeare said about democracy, the least worst of all the possible systems for Iran at the moment. The Revolutionary Guards are the defenders of that legacy. They expand Iranian influence as part of that defensive effort. And again, defensive doesn't mean not proactive. Defensive doesn't mean refraining from terrorism. That is how Iranians understand strategic defense. And the Revolutionary Guard, again, more than anything, is practical. If they want to go someplace, they can't get in through the door, they'll go in through the window. And once they're there, they'll stay there. Are they building a huge connect the dots picture where eventually, once all the dots are connected, they will bring into existence a Shia caliphate? I highly doubt it. I put it to you that it does not sit well with everything we've heard here today. Everything we've heard displays tactical brilliance. The Iranians are really, certainly the Revolutionary Guards, they're tactical geniuses. They know how to establish these structures. They are a threat. Are they a strategic threat? I did not see any demonstration today that that is the case. What I saw was a very efficient operation that seeks to stabilize and sustain communal ties, to maintain Iranian presence all over the world and make Iran a viable, relevant factor in every decision that could potentially affect Iranian interests. And the potential for hostility, certainly, but not as the generating force or the origin of the source. I saw very careful, very studious, elaborate, articulate demonstrations of how Iranians effectively do what they set out to do. The basic premise of so many looks, so many scholarly observations and security-driven understandings of the Iranian system as a system that seeks only to wreak havoc, I thought that the demonstrations we saw today did not leave us with that message. I'm just about to end, and I want again to reiterate the basic point. We're talking about practitioners and pragmatists whose main wish is survival. It doesn't mean that they are not dire enemies. It doesn't mean that they are not seeking to perpetrate harm on Israel, on the United States, on Europe, on the world. But in order to beat them effectively, the desire to wipe out the ideology, or to, as Israeli politicians like to say, crush the snake's head in Tehran, I think ultimately that will play into Iranian hands. Iranians are aware of the discrepancy, of the cognitive dissonance between the way they see themselves and the way the world sees them. They use it to their competitive advantage. We need to get smart about this, and we need to be able to play the practical, pragmatic game that Iran is playing in order to effectively defeat its terrorist efforts. Thank you.